Okay, let me move everybody out of the way here. So I can't see the chat anymore, Justina, so if something comes up there, maybe you could let me know.
No problem.
Okay, wonderful. So as Justina said, my name is Dr. Joelle Rodway. I'm a assistant professor of leadership and policy at the Faculty of Education here in the G.A. Hickman building. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather are as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost forever and can never be recovered. I also acknowledge the island of Ukdahumguk, Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. And I acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatukavut. We recognize all First Peoples who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. I'm starting with the land acknowledgement with the specific purpose of explaining how the land acknowledgement has actually affected the design of the course and the work that I'm doing today. One thing you may have noticed is that this is not the Memorial University's land acknowledgement. It's actually one taken from First Light. And I've put a link here if you're interested. First Light has a lot of resources that we can draw upon in our community. But why I choose to use this particular land acknowledgement is because it's a bit of a history lesson in some ways for folks who may not know the history of the Beothuk peoples on the island of Newfoundland. And it is a call to action in terms of recognizing that First People still live among us. We still live on their land. And for me, this was a call to action. I had been doing quite a bit of reading. I had read Hayden King's article around the performativity of land acknowledgements, which I found really bothersome. So that entered into my thought space. And also when I was thinking about course design, I was thinking about things that I had learned from my studies in Indigenous education around structural inequities and systemic racism and those sorts of things. So all of these sorts of concepts and ideas were floating around in my thought space as an educator. So I share that with you intentionally, sort of like as a background of where my own professional learning has been. I've been an educator for, oh goodness, over 20 years now, hard to believe, but I started my career as a high school teacher. I taught high school for 6 years and then went to graduate school and then ended up in this role. And when I'm thinking about how I've been teaching over that 20 years and learning, I've been thinking about all that I've learned from Bell Hook's readings and Paulo Freire's ideas around education as emancipatory or liberatory, and working towards a more liberatory pedagogy. So these were the ideas that I was coming to my courses with, and I'm going to share one of my course designs with you today in hopes of just providing a living example. Of course, things are changing all the time, but as a conversation starter. So I started with our acknowledging the land. I'm going to move on to talking about what my particular teaching context is. Lots of times I've attended these workshops. I know that folks either here in attendance who may view it later, we're not all coming from the same teaching context. So it's important for me to articulate mine, although I will do my best throughout the presentation to acknowledge and make suggestions of what this might look like in other environments. I'm going to provide an example of a ePortfolio, which is the main sort of assessment tool that I use in my seminar course. And I'll talk to you about what my current challenges are with this course design, the feedback I've received from students. I'll be teaching this course again in the winter 2023, so this is really timely. It's getting my head back into thinking about what I'm going to change for the next time around, and then if anyone has any questions, we can discuss at the end. So my teaching context is, I teach mainly at the graduate level. I'm in a faculty of education, which is a professional school. We offer a professional master's of education degree. And what I mean by that is a large proportion of our graduate students here are working professionals, current teachers, either in K-12 public schools here in Newfoundland and Labrador, but also I've had students from coast to coast to coast. Working in a variety of educational settings across Canada. I also have educators from schools located internationally. It could be public school, publicly funded or privately funded schools. And also more recently, I'm getting more and more instructors from post-secondary institutions also joining our class. As it's a graduate course, the maximum class size is 20, so I know I'm speaking from that context. So for those folks who teach first and second year undergraduate courses with large class sizes, there's a particular set of challenges that might need to be addressed here, if this is even suitable at all for large scale. But I will say for me, I keep my class size at 20. I have a reputation of not accepting overloads in the course. And I do that, as you'll see, intentionally because I focus a lot on feedback. So to take on more students would be to provide less feedback to the 20 that I have in the course. The specific intention of this course, you can see from the course description, is to consider school improvement processes from the point of view of theory and research, but also around school-based practices. So the course naturally lends itself to a space where connecting research, theory, and practice is really at the heart of what we're trying to do within this course. As an educator myself, you know, one of my areas of research interest is around research use. My doctoral work was in research use and policy development. And when I was in graduate school at the University of Toronto, I was very interested in trying to understand why, when I was an educator in the system, I didn't have access to, I wasn't aware of, and even in my pre-service teaching degree, in my Bachelor of Education years, I didn't have exposure to research as something to inform my practice. So this has become an area of research for me, and I'm taking what I'm learning from my research and then applying it in the classroom. So here's my course design. I currently, and it's important for me to say, I've taught this course now, I think I looked it up yesterday, I think 6 times I've taught this course. So that in and of itself is a privilege. I'm thankful that the leadership here in my faculty allows me to teach this course at least once, if not twice a year. It gives me an opportunity to constantly be rethinking and revising what I'm doing. Here's the most recent iteration of what my course looked like in the spring of 2022. And I say that in acknowledging that in the spring of 2019, which was the first time I taught this course, it was very different. It was very conventional. Back at that point, it was different readings every week, assignments every week. I should also say that I teach predominantly online because we're a professional school in terms of accessibility. I teach predominantly online. So this is an online structure, although I have thought my way through what this would look like in a face-to-face classroom, although I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. So I take the course term and I split it up into 4 learning blocks, as you can see there, and each learning block, with the exception of the last, runs for 4 weeks. And what I do is in learning blocks 1 through 3, I follow the same structure. So we're looping through a particular activity flow 3 times throughout the course of the term. So I start with 2 weeks for reading, and this is based on student feedback. So I noticed that when I had readings assigned for every week, students weren't doing them. Or I would use sort of as a general rule, I would typically assign 3 course readings. So anywhere from 60, 80, no, definitely not more than 100 pages in a week for students to read. When I was doing this on a weekly basis, they weren't reading them. They would just comment on one. Most students would read one article. Some would read all 3, but not very many. So in this course design, what I decided to do was take the first 2 weeks and just say, you have to do nothing else. So there's no discussion board in this version of the course. I eliminated the discussion boards to provide time for students to do the reading. The discussion boards I found were encouraging really shallow reading, and they were just, skimming the articles to make the point in response to the discussion board prompt. So I decided to sacrifice that learning space in order to open up a full 2 weeks for reading. So students are required to complete close readings of all assigned articles. I scaffold that with some materials in my course shell around how to read academic reading. I quickly saw a question pop up here about reading during class sessions. Because it's an online class, it's asynchronous, so there's no synchronous time in class. But thinking about that in preparing for a face-to-face class, they wouldn't be reading in the class. I would use the class time for discussion, but working on the activity, which I'll get to. But we would not be necessarily using all of the class time to support that reading. In the first learning block, I prescribed the course reading. So there's a set of core readings around theory of change and what do we mean by school improvement and organizational improvement more generally. So I prescribe that set of readings, and I really guide them through the process in the first couple of weeks. In learning blocks 2 and 3, students choose what I call like a reading bundle. So if you were to go in, and I have a link here, and I'll put these links up separately. If you were to go into my course syllabus, you'll see I have different themes. So let's say 1 week or 1 reading bundle is about standards and accountability and scaling up change. So if a student selects that reading bundle, they've got a series of articles, so 3 must reads, and then there's further recommended reading for each theme, but they can choose different reading bundles. So this was the first big decision that I had to make that as a professor was really difficult, because what it means is whereas before I would have 12 different weeks with 12 different themes, and I was expecting students to read everything, what I did was I've made it so that they choose the topics that they're the most interested in reading, and I'm allowing them to choose that reading bundle. So students, and there's 4 reading bundles, they end up reading 3 of the 4. So that was really hard for me because, of course, I think that all of the topics are important. But when I was reflecting on, it's this question around depth versus breadth. And because I was noticing that so many of them, when I was working on a weekly schedule, weren't doing the reading, I decided I'd rather cut out some of the topics and have them do all the reading do a deeper dive for the weeks that they selected. So in those 2 weeks, that's what students are doing. And in blocks 2 and 3, they get to choose your own adventure, so to speak. Then the 3rd week in the learning block is where we get into making sense of those readings. I really do a lot of work trying to model and build the skills of my students for reading across the articles. So often I would notice students reading within an article. So like their discussion post would just be, well, Rodway 2018 said blah, 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 and give a response there. What I wanted, or what I'm trying to do, one of the goals of the course is getting them to understand what's the conversation that's happening within that reading bundle. So I use the analogy of a dinner table, and I say, pretend that all of the authors, or at least one of the authors from each paper, is at this dinner party and we're all sitting in a dining room. What's the conversation? So how do these articles speak to each other? And to help them build that skill set, I've developed a repertoire of activities from Harvard University's Project Zero thinking routines, and I've adapted them for a post-secondary setting. And the activity is deliberately designed to get them thinking how the articles speak to each other. So that's the opportunity for them to practice that level of synthesis in their critical reading skills. So I block out a full week for them to be able to do that activity. There's no further reading added at that point. Then the final week of each learning block is I'm asking them to reflect on the reading and the completion of the activity. And they write a critical reflection where they're taking the key concepts and ideas from the reading and thinking about it in relation to their own professional practice. So in a couple of slides from now, I'm going to talk about how I bookend the course, but I'll say right at the very beginning, before we do anything else, before they've done any of the reading, I ask them to write a short one-page response to the simple question, how do schools improve? So I keep referring to that to them, saying, you know, think about your experience in the schools or learning institutions where you've worked, about how you've been working towards organizational improvement. What are the activities that are happening in your space? And then in that fourth week, I ask them to write a critical reflection that very deliberately is making connections between what they've learned about in their reading bundle for that week and their professional practice. So collectively, these four things then create an artifact that they submit, that they collate and submit using an electronic portfolio. So for the last few years, I've been using e-portfolios as a way of documenting learning. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about that here, and what I can do, and I regret I didn't do it at the beginning, but I can do it later on, is share my slides with you. And there's a link, or if you go to the CITL's YouTube channel, there's a video there for a talk that I gave earlier this year about using e-portfolios to build critical thinking skills. So you can get more detail on the e-portfolio there, and I had one of my former students presenting with me. But in this context, suffice it to say, they collate the artifact from their learning from the Minds-On activity. So there's some sort of a template that they have to fill out. So they submit that artifact from the activity, plus they're written about 750 to 1,000 words critical reflection at the end of that learning block. And then I provide feedback on that. So we run through this cycle 3 times. The first one is really guided, where I'm providing a lot of scaffolding. Even though the course is asynchronous, meaning we're not regularly gathering online, I do build into my course a segment called the Gathering Place, which are evening sessions, generally once, I would say, per learning block, where I jump online and we have like an open course where folks can come. We talk about readings, we talk about whatever they need. It's a way for me to provide synchronous support for them. So we run through that for 3 learning blocks. And then the last learning block is a bit different because it's shorter. So it's week 13 in the regular class schedule. We have a second set of assigned small number of readings to wrap up the course. And then during the exam block, obviously there's no exam in this course, but I asked them to write a final critical reflection paper, which is a reflection on that original piece at the beginning in their response to how do schools improve. So you can see here, this is what it looks like. Phase 1 is the understanding the research page part of the process. The Minds-On activity is where they're continuing with building that understanding and connecting to practice. And the critical reflection is really where I'm asking them to bring the 2 together. What I want to focus on here is, you'll notice down in the bottom left-hand corner, I do 3 rounds of feedback. So It's pretty labor intensive, and I'll talk about that when I get to my current challenges and let you know what my thinking is at the moment based on student feedback. But for the first round of feedback, I always do it by voice. I record audio files, short, like maximum 5 minutes. I do it using the Brightspace tools. So everybody submits to the Dropbox folder in Brightspace, but what they're submitting is just the website address for their digital portfolio. And then I go back in using the tools and I provide audio feedback. Most of the students have told me that they really like that, because I find the very first round, it's very difficult for them. I find a lot of my students find the critical reflection piece really difficult. I've given them a rubric, and I'll put in the slide deck, I've linked to my actual course syllabus so you can see that. But in the rubric, we talk about 3 different levels: a descriptive, analytic, and then critical, analytical, and then critical. And most students in the very first round, at the end of the first learning block, are somewhere in that highly descriptive, early analytical phase, which is challenging for a lot of these folks, because a lot of them are motivated to get an A. So I find using audio feedback, and students have told me that what they like about the audio feedback is that they can hear my voice. So in one way, it's creating a personal connection between me and the student, because even though I use a lot of videos in my course, this is me talking directly to them, and then there's no misunderstandings with tone. So what I'll do is, I'll just talk through. I'll say on page whatever you reference this, and I'll give the feedback. And then of course the audio file is there if they want to download it and have it transcribed. In the second round, I provide written feedback. So this time around, I go through and I use the annotation notes in the Brightspace shell for some of the web pages. It depends on how they submit it. If they submit a link to a PDF, then I can use the Brightspace tools. Otherwise, I use a variety of other digital tools on my computer to provide written feedback. And then round 3, depending on student preferences, if students are fine with audio feedback, I give audio feedback because frankly, it's faster. It's a time management technique for me, but some students prefer written, so I do that too. And then of course, in the gathering place sections, I do 1 per month. I'm providing feedback based on what I'm seeing from across student work. So here's an example, and when I share the slides, you can see up here at the top, like all of these things are hyperlinked, so you can click on this, and one of my former students, Trevor, who's actually in that other video that I referenced, is allowing me to use his as a sample. Students will create a web page. Trevor did his using MUN's e-portfolio tool, which I'll talk about in a second when I talk about enablers and barriers to learning. But so you can see over here, they have, at the time they were doing 6 artifacts, now I'm doing 3. So you can see there's been lots of revision there. But you would click on that, and then they've written some sort of introduction with a link to the artifact. And then if you were scrolling down this page, you can see Trevor has this, his reflection built right into the web page on the website. The idea for using an e-portfolio was as a form of pedagogical documentation. So I was using this as a platform for students to document their learning, creating a concrete artifact of their thinking and learning in the course. Professionally, keeping in mind that a lot of the folks that come through and do a master's degree in educational leadership and policy are folks who are planning on pursuing leadership and administrative roles within school systems. So lots of them, and I know some of them have used them in job interviews. So that was part of my thinking as well, is that it provides an example. I know Trevor actually used his e-portfolio. He was a principal when he was in my class, or he still is a principal, and he used his learning portfolio with the staff in his school as an example of his own professional learning. So that was the rationale for using an e-portfolio, although I will say, as I've noted here on the slide, that the digital format for some students, not all, was a barrier. So it really depended on students' level of comfort using digital tools. So for some students, I didn't want the creation of the e-portfolio to interfere or prevent them from engaging with the course content. So for some folks, their portfolio was a collection of written documents, which was fine, but for most, it was the website. And so here's an example of a learning artifact. One of the weeks in the reading bundle, or one of the themes in the reading bundles is professional learning. And my particular area of expertise is in social networks. And I use a lot of social network mapping in my research. So I do a live workshop with the students, and they come after having completed the readings, and I guide them through an activity. So this is an example, what you see here. This network map was something that Trevor created as a result of a guided network mapping activity that he and colleagues from the class did with me. And then they use that experience as what they're writing their critical reflection about. This is a slide from that earlier presentation that I had mentioned. And you can see these are Trevor's comments over here around what the benefits of this experience was for himself, talking about representing his own experiences and perceptions of his professional practice, helping engage others with his learning, because he then took this back and was using it as a learning tool in his own school, and promoted creativity and risk-taking. The risk-taking piece I've found has been essential in this idea of connecting research and practice. Learning block number 1 in particular is all about getting them to abandon ideas that there's a right answer. So for me, it's not like if they're not coming into that particular course environment where they need to exit with, I'm thinking of like a science course or something like that, where they're memorizing formulas or there's a list of concrete ideas that they need to move on to advance to a next course. This course is really standalone in that way. So I'm able to experiment in ways that I might not be able to say in some of the undergraduate courses that I teach. But this idea around risk-taking in my conversations with students has become something that I have to pay more attention to when I'm asking them to connect research and practice, because the idea of connecting with them individually through voice, through video, through the synchronous sessions is to build that trust. Because in order for them to be relating their practice to their research and the critical reflections, they have to be willing to share their practice with me. And lots of teachers are really afraid of that. They're afraid of making their practice public. They're afraid of the judgment that comes along with that. So there's a lot of relational work that's also happening in this space that's enabling this type of work. However, you can see, this network map is a concrete example of how we're taking a lot of sociological concepts and ideas and bringing it into a practice space. Again, another slide from Trevor from our previous presentation, and you can actually scan that barcode and go to his learning portfolio. But I've just highlighted over here from his viewpoint. He created this all on his own before we were coming together in the springtime. And one of the points that he had here was it allowed him to engage in authentic, meaningful learning that directly connected theory and practice. So a lot of teachers coming through, it's not uncommon, and for other folks who are teaching in professional schools, I would be curious to know if you have the same experience, but certainly in the realm of education, it's not uncommon to hear folks say there's a disconnect between what they learn at the university versus what they experience when they're working in the field. And for many of the students, Trevor was in my 2019 offering of this course, but I keep hearing this over and over again, is that the structure of the e-portfolio with that learning design is creating a space for them to actually take those risks and think about how what they're reading connects to their practice. I will say Trevor was in the first group to do this, so he was doing it week by week, and it was a really heavy load. It's since evolved to the learning blocks and to having 3 artifacts as opposed to the 6 that Trevor did. And one of the things that the students have been telling me, and that I'll carry with me into my next round, is having that dedicated thinking time. So they really appreciate the first half of the block if they're focused on the reading. So they're just focusing on that time. It allows them to, you know, depending on what their work demands are, it allows them to distribute their workload a little more easily than if we were working in a weekly block structure. But having the dedicated thinking time built into the schedule from the student's point of view, at least based on the feedback, and I have fairly high response rates to my feedback questionnaires that I put out in my course, is that not having to worry about doing more readings that week creates more space for them to think their way through it. And you can see here, Trevor actually went on. We have multiple pathways in our master's degree programs. Most teachers elect to do 10 courses, and they complete the 10 courses and then they graduate. But we also have one of our pathways is to do a research project. So we have a thesis as well, but a research project is a bit smaller scale. And I find in this course in particular, I generally will have 2 to 3, sometimes even up to 4 or 5 students come to me asking to switch their program route from course route to pursue a project, which has had the sort of unanticipated consequence of having a higher supervision load than I may have thought about initially. But I feel as though, you know, this is a good problem to have. This I covered earlier, so it's that book ending, right? So in the beginning, I asked them a question, which is really tracking, like, what is their thinking before they do engage with any of the material in the course about how the schools improve. Typically, those statements, a lot of students will articulate something that they're disgruntled with in their own school, something that their school leaders are doing that they disagree with, or, you know, they'll say, we're not doing the right things, or that sort of thing. But on that last critical reflection, what I ask them to do is to go back to, like, think about everything they've done in the preceding learning block, go back to their original statement or original response to that question, and think about, you know, were there areas where their knowledge has, you know, enriched their understanding, or places of congruence, I guess, like points of congruence, and then points of divergence, and use the research that's covered in the course to help with a more clearer and research-informed articulation of how schools improve. So I don't ask them to go on and do more research. The course reading list is the course reading list. There's no additional reading. But because I have no additional reading, when I'm giving feedback, one of the look-fors in those ePortfolio artifacts is they need to provide evidence that they've done a really close reading of those articles. So there's no space for you to not do the readings, and that's built into the course design. So here's where I am. I'm actually not the third iteration. Well, it's the third iteration of the ePortfolio course design, because I was doing it differently when I first started out. In the springtime, I was considering that depth versus breadth question. And over the spring-summer term, I used this course design that I presented here, and the 3 artifacts worked well. I think it alleviated some of the stress for students. I received a lot of positive feedback. It was a manageable workload. This year was the first year I used the learning block structure, which really worked really well for them. And because we were repeating it the 3 times, that worked well as well. So I'm going to keep that the same. The students definitely, I noticed a huge difference with the way they're able to talk about the course readings. They were working really hard. On that conversational piece and reading across a body of literature, not just within individual pieces. So I think the course design allowed them the thinking time and space to practice those skills as well without layering on more content. I'm trying to figure out now, you know, the hardest part for me here is this feedback piece. Most students, well, all students appreciate the feedback. I don't put grades on it when I give them back at the end of each learning block. And some students, a small number, but probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 students in the class really want me to give them a number. They really are attached to a grade. So, you know, I will say to them, I'll give them some sort of a range, but it's really, to me, it doesn't matter. But you know, I will say, well, if you're in the analytical range, you're probably somewhere between 75 to a 90, and if you get into the critical realm, you're north of 90, which they're happy with. But there is this culture shift. The feedback only, particularly for folks who are used to coming up through a system where everything was dependent on a grade, is really hard. But the students have all also expressed their gratitude for the depth of feedback that I have to provide, because frankly, they wouldn't be able to make those connections without that level of feedback. The challenge for me is even though I keep my course enrollment at 20 and my course is always full, it's always maxed out, it's a really high burden. So like I'll block out the time and they have to submit it at the end. I give them a due date, but it's flexible. I'm not a stickler. I just tell them I'm going to provide feedback based on when the piece was submitted. It is demanding for me to do that 3 months in a row. So I think what I'm going to try out this time around is I'm going to give them the feedback in learning block 1 and learning block 2, but I'm going to build in some peer feedback structures for learning block 3 to give me a bit of reprieve, because the time between the end of learning block 3 and the end of the course is really tight. So I think I'm going to, this time around, my experimentation is going to be around peer feedback. And then lastly, to address the challenges with grades, so people who are really married to this idea and need to have some concrete explanation around how grades are going to be calculated. In the winter term, I'm going to take what I've been learning from some of our colleagues here at Memorial and other places where I've been doing my own learning, is I'm going to try out contract grading. This is to, as I say, relieve the elephant in the room. And so that's where I am with my course design there. So we'll see how it goes. And so that's where I'm hoping I could get some feedback from you, although I know that time is precious. Here today, we might not have time to do that, but if you're interested in continuing the conversation, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share my materials and continue the conversation with you.